The house felt unusually still that Friday evening, a hush so complete it settled into my bones. After a long, draining week, I welcomed the silence. I was bone-tired and only wanted to sink into sleep. I crawled into bed with little more than the motion of changing into pajamas before collapsing under the covers, certain the quiet of the night would hold. For 8 years I had been raising my son, Daniel, on my own. The divorce hadn't been bitter. There was no great enemy between us, only the slow drift that sometimes happens when two lives stop fitting together. Taking care of Daniel by myself had been the most fulfilling and the most difficult chapter of my life. He was everything to me, clever, quick with a joke, and generous in ways that made my chest swell with pride. Yet balancing the roles of mother and father had been exhausting at times. Even so, we had made a life that felt steady and true. That night the house around me seemed to breathe quietly. I watched pale moonlight sift through the thin curtains, drawing soft, moving patterns across the walls. I tucked myself under the blanket and let my thoughts wander, relieved by this gentler stretch of life after a hard year. Daniel had been my anchor for so long. Now, at almost 20, he still carried a tenderness that sometimes made me worry he took on too much for his years. I smiled inwardly at the memory of him, so kind, so thoughtful, and then sleep leaned in. A light knock at my bedroom door tugged me back from the edge of dreams. At first I thought it might be part of a stray dream, but the sound came again, patient and muffled. "Mom," came Daniel's voice, barely more than a breath. I blinked toward the doorway, where his silhouette hovered in the dim hall light. I sat up, trying to clear the last fuzz of sleep from my head. "Daniel? What is it?" I asked, my voice low and still thick with tiredness. He hesitated at the threshold, then slipped inside and closed the door with a careful, almost furtive motion. He stood for a moment before moving toward the bed, like someone unsure whether he should cross an invisible line. "I can't sleep," he said, looking down. There was a worn look on his face, tiredness and something heavier like worry, and it made my worry swell in response. Since the divorce, he occasionally had trouble settling his mind at night, but he hardly ever let on how much it affected him. "Come here," I murmured, patting the space at my side. "You can stay here tonight if you want." He took a beat, then climbed in and curled up beside me on his side, facing me. In the faint silver light, I could see the soft slump of him, less guarded, more exposed than he usually allowed. It warmed me that he wanted to be close, to press against the familiarity of home. I smoothed a stray lock of hair from his forehead and tucked the blanket up to his shoulders. "Do you want to talk?" I asked. Daniel shook his head and let his hair fall back over his eyes. "No. I just wanted to be near you," he said in a voice small as a whisper. The admission lodged in my chest like a gentle thing. It had been a long time since he'd needed to be this near, as when he was a child. I reached out and rested my hand on his shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing as it slowed toward sleep. "That's fine," I told him. "Stay as long as you need." We lay there in companionable quiet for a while. The house's hush wrapped around us, and I thought he had drifted off. His breaths grew deep and regular, and I breathed easier, allowing myself to sink back toward rest. Then his voice slipped out again, scarcely louder than a thought. "Mom," he asked, as though testing the question in the air. "Do you ever miss him?" The question landed harder than I expected. It was one I'd danced around since the separation, an ache I had not wanted to name aloud. I felt the familiar tug at my throat, but tried to answer honestly. "Sometimes," I said after a moment, soft and truthful. "I miss pieces of what we had. But, you know, things weren't right between us." He nodded without meeting my eyes. The silence that followed felt full of old, complicated histories, of small kindnesses and large injuries, of what had been lost and what had been learned. I didn't press him for more, and he didn't press me. Instead, we let those words sit between us and do their quiet, necessary work. For a time, we simply listened to the night, the slow hush of the house, the rustle of fabric, our breathing in shared rhythm. In that gentle stillness, the old, raw edges of absence felt less sharp. Daniel shifted closer, his shoulder touching mine, and I felt an odd, fierce gratitude for the life we had made together. Imperfect, intimate, durable. Outside, the moon moved on. Under the blanket, wrapped in the comfort of each other, we let the dark hold us until sleep finally came. "Do you ever think things could have gone another way?" he asked. I exhaled, the question dragging old regrets back into the room. "Sometimes," I admitted after a pause, "but we can't change what's already happened. We have to keep going." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. Daniel picked at the hem of the blanket, eyes fixed on his hands. "I just wonder if maybe I could have done something," he murmured. "Like if I'd been better." His words landed like stones. I turned and faced him immediately. "No," I said, sharp with conviction. "This wasn't your fault. You didn't do anything to cause it." My tone was soft then, urgent with the need to set him free of that blame. He looked away, his next words were barely audible. "Sometimes it feels like if I'd been better, Dad wouldn't have left." Heat rose behind my eyes. I drew him into an embrace, and at first he stiffened as if unsure whether he should yield. Then he curled into me, his face tucked against my shoulder, and the weight of his sorrow pressed into my chest. "Listen to me," I said, my voice catching. "Your father made his own choices. It had nothing to do with you. That was on him, not you. You have always been more than enough." I let the truth fall into the small space between us, over and over until his breathing eased. We held one another in the quiet. Minutes stretched and softened, and his body grew more relaxed. Eventually sleep claimed him, shallow and even. I stayed awake for a while longer, thoughts and memories moving through me in the dark. We had weathered so much together, the loyalty and love, the losses and the compromises, and I thought of how fiercely I wanted to protect him from any burden. But as the night wore on, something unexpected crept up inside me, a warmth that did not feel entirely like the familiar tide of maternal love. It was subtle at first, a tenderness turned inward in a way I couldn't name, a closeness that felt, alarmingly, a shade different than the protective comfort I always gave him. I tried to quiet that stir, to pin it down as nothing but exhaustion and relief that he was near, but the feeling hummed insistently beneath the surface. Dawn came sooner than I wanted. Pale light washed the room and painted Daniel's features soft and untroubled. He looked like someone who had been released from a long-held weight. The earlier tension was gone from his face. I watched him sleep, so handsome in the soft light, and pride swelled in me. I slipped out of bed with care, leaving him undisturbed, and went downstairs to make breakfast. The simple acts of the morning, measuring coffee, toasting bread, grounded me, offering a rhythm that felt safe. Still, my mind returned again and again to the night and the questions we'd unearthed. I knew now, with an ache that settled into my bones, how deeply Daniel had internalized his father's absence. The guilt he carried troubled me more than anything. If I could have lifted it from him, I would have, no matter what it cost me. But it was not only his sorrow that lingered in my thoughts. It was the look he'd given me in the dimness, the way he had been vulnerable and unguarded, an expression that had lit something tender and unfamiliar inside me. I admonished myself gently. He is my son. That boundary steadied me, and I clung to it. Yet the other feeling, the quiet whisper of a connection that didn't fit the tidy categories I expected, refused to vanish completely. It hovered at the edges of my awareness, puzzling and unwelcome, and I spent the morning bargaining with it like someone who has seen a shadow and cannot decide if it belongs to a person or to a tree. By the time Daniel padded downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes, I had folded the day's routine into place. Coffee steamed on the counter. Plates were warm. I smiled at him, offering breakfast and ordinary comfort, even as questions and cautions pulsed inside me. There were truths I needed to hold on to for both our sakes, and there were feelings I had to name for myself, quietly, honestly, before they could change anything between us. The whisper that would not be quieted lingered inside me. Eventually Daniel rose from sleep, hair tousled, his lanky frame still bearing the awkward traces of adolescence, but with a quiet maturity in his eyes. a hint of the man he was becoming. I met him with a warm smile, doing my best to hide the residue of the previous night. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said, placing a plate of pancakes before him. "Thanks," he mumbled, settling into his chair and digging in. We ate in companionable silence while the morning light spilled across the kitchen, turning dust motes into a slow, golden rain. Now and then I felt his gaze on me, curious and earnest, but I kept my silence about the night before. He seemed steadier, more himself, and I didn't want to disturb the fragile peace we had found. Finally, he broke the quiet. "Thanks for last night, Mom," he said, voice soft. "I really needed that." His vulnerability stopped me for a moment. "You never have to thank me," I replied. "I'll always be here for you." He nodded, but his eyes held a question he hadn't put into words. There was a new intensity there, a desire for closeness that went beyond the easy script of mother and son. Part of me, a part one hadn't wanted to admit, felt it too. After breakfast, he lingered at the counter, fingertip tracing idle patterns on the laminate. "Do you ever think things could have been different?" he asked quietly, the old hurt threaded through his voice. I let out a slow breath. The question carried the weight of regret. "Maybe," I said at last. "But we can't change what happened. All we can do is move forward." He looked down at his restless hands. "Sometimes I wonder if I could have done something. If I'd been better." The words were a whisper thick with guilt. They stabbed at me. I reached out, put my hand on his shoulder, and drew him into a hug. He tensed for a heartbeat, then folded into me, face buried at my collarbone. "Daniel," I said, my voice shaking with the fierce urgency of a mother. "You didn't do anything wrong. Your father made his own choices. That was on him, not you. You have always been enough." His shoulders eased. He let out a breath that sounded like surrender and sleepiness at once. As I held him, relief and affection swelled in me, familiar currents of maternal love, but underneath them something else stirred, an odd warmth, a closeness that didn't fit neatly into the category of parent and child. I pushed the sensation away, telling myself it was fatigue or the simple comfort of being near someone you love. Still, it refused to be silenced. Dawn moved through the curtains and painted Daniel's face in soft light. He looked peaceful, transformed from the restless young man who had come to my room in the night. I watched him for a while, chest full of love and pride. Then, carefully so as not to wake him, I slipped downstairs. The small rituals of breakfast, coffee steaming, batter sizzling, offered steadiness to the jittery place inside me. Even as I worked, my mind returned to the confession he had carried and the way he had leaned into me. The guilt he bore for his father's leaving felt like a stone lodged in my heart. I wanted to remove it for him. But beyond that, there was the way he'd looked at me in the dim. Light, open, tender, searching. The fact that the sight had awakened something unfamiliar in me alarmed and unsettled me both. I told myself sharply, "He is my son." That boundary steadied me, but it didn't erase the whispering feeling that had taken up residence at the edges of my thoughts. When Daniel came downstairs again, rubbing the last sleep from his eyes, I offered a smile and sat another plate on the table. He ate with an appetite that made me glad, ordinary hunger anchoring us in life's everyday rhythms. We spoke in small, practical ways about his day and his homework. The conversation was intended to be light, but each sentence carried the shadow of what had been said and left unsaid. At one point he looked up, searching my face. The unasked question hovered between us, a fragile thing I wasn't ready to name. There was tenderness in his look, and something more, an intensity that unnerved me, as though a line both familiar and suddenly less secure trembled beneath our feet. For now, we let things remain unspoken. We kept to the pattern of ordinary days, measuring coffee, folding napkins, checking the clock, while inside me the new awareness quietly gathered strength. As the day unfolded, Daniel retreated to his room to tackle homework and the refuge of video games. The house resumed its familiar cadence. I stood at the sink, hands warm in sudsy water, and tried to order my thoughts. We had crossed an invisible threshold in the night, one that had shifted the balance between us in ways I could not yet name. Fear and anticipation braided together. Fear of what acknowledgement might demand, and a cautious anticipation at the edges of an unknown future. I resolved, without quite deciding how, to protect him and to protect the fragile truth of who we were. Whatever stirred in me would need watching and containment. For now, I would be the steady presence he needed, the safe harbor. Later, when the moment allowed, I would face whatever questions that night had opened. Until then, I folded another pancake, put a plate on the table, and kept my voice light as I asked, "Do you need anything else before you go?" The uneasy whisper inside me refused to be quiet. As evening settled, Daniel emerged from his room, hair still rumpled from sleep, his lanky body carrying the last traces of adolescence. But there was something different now, an adult steadiness in his eyes, as if the boy I'd known was quietly stepping aside for the man he was becoming. I greeted him with a smile that tried to hide the residue of the night. "Morning, sleepyhead," I said, setting a plate of golden pancakes in front of him. "Thanks," he muttered, settling at the table and digging in. We ate with the easy silence of people who know each other's rhythms, sunlight warming the kitchen and turning ordinary things soft around the edges. I felt him glance at me from time to time, curious and tentative, but I kept my mouth shut about the late-night conversation. He seemed steadier, less raw, and I didn't want to break the fragile truce we'd found. After dishes and a half-hearted attempt at small talk, the afternoons stretched into ordinary chores. Daniel retreated to his room for homework and video games while I folded laundry and scrubbed counters, but the house felt different. An undercurrent of tension hummed at the edges of every task. The closeness from the night before had shifted something between us, subtle and seismic at once. The more I thought about it, the more I realized my feelings had altered. They had drifted beyond the familiar shore of maternal love into unfamiliar waters. That evening, after dinner, we sank onto the couch to watch a movie. The room was dim, the television's flicker throwing moving shadows across the walls. We started the film with a comfortable silence, but as scenes and credits rolled, I became acutely aware of him beside me, the soft brush of his arm against mine, the warmth of his shoulder close by. My heart thudded. Midway through the movie, Daniel shifted closer, pressing a little more firmly into the space between us. This time, he didn't pull away. When his arm touched mine and stayed, a small, electric awareness ran through me. I stole a glance and found his eyes meeting mine, his look deep, open, and charged with an intensity one hadn't seen before. Without thinking, I took his hand. Our fingers braided together as naturally as breath. He didn't resist. Instead, he squeezed my hand, his thumb drawing tiny, slow circles on my skin. The gesture was innocent, intimate, and it set my pulse fluttering in a way that felt both recognizably maternal and oddly new. We sat like that for a while, palms clasped in the dim light, a quiet testament to a changing pattern between us. It felt like a turning point, not a loud declaration but a small, wordless agreement that things were different now. The movie ended. The credits rolled unnoticed. I rested my head on his shoulder and felt the steady rise and fall of his breath. His presence was comfort itself, but it also carried a current I couldn't neatly name. "Mom," he breathed, barely more than a sound, "I'm really glad you were there last night." "I'm glad you came," I answered. The words were simple but deep, an echo of the gratitude and relief I felt, and of something more complicated that lay beyond words. As the night drew in, that same trembling awareness stirred again, an anxious, anticipatory feeling that made the familiar boundary between us feel thin. It frightened me, the realization that the relationship I had carefully defined my entire adult life might be shifting into territory I had never planned for. Yet alongside the apprehension was a strange sense of possibility, an acknowledgement that this was only the beginning of something neither of us fully understood. When sleep finally took us, dawn arrived softly. Daniel lay beside me, face calm and unclenched. I watched him for a long time, my heart filling with a deep, protective love. But beneath that love another current persisted, the same unfamiliar sensation that had surfaced in the living room, a warmth and closeness that made me question the neat categories I had always used to describe us. I slipped out of bed carefully, leaving him sleeping, and went downstairs to make breakfast. The routine steadied me, batter sizzling, coffee steaming, the house settling into its midday rhythm. Yet my mind kept returning to his confession, to the guilt he carried over his father's leaving, and to how he had sought comfort in my arms. The weight of his pain made me want to shield him forever. More confusingly, his vulnerability had awakened something tender in me that felt different from the protective instinct I had always known. I scolded myself. He is my son, holding on to that as a lifeline. Still, the feeling lingered, a persistent whisper at the edge of my awareness. When Daniel padded downstairs, rubbing sleep from his eyes and pulling on his shirt, I offered him a smile and another plate. He ate with appetite, and we traded small talk about his classes and what needed fixing around the house, the sort of practical exchange that keeps days moving. But between the sentences, between the cups of coffee and the clink of dishes, there was a suspended moment of mutual recognition. We had crossed a line, however quietly, and the map of our relationship no longer fit perfectly. He retreated to his room later, headphones in, fingers flying over the controller, and the ordinary hum of life resumed around me. I stood at the sink, the water warm over my hands, and tried to marshal my thoughts. Fear and a peculiar excitement braided themselves together inside me. I knew I needed to watch and contain what had awakened, to protect him and to preserve the foundations of our family. I also knew that denial would not make the feeling vanish. For now, I told myself, I would stay present and steady. I would be the safe harbor he needed, a mother who loved fiercely and would carry him through whatever storms came. When the time was right, I would confront the new things that had come awake between us. Until then, I folded another towel, set it on the shelf, and kept my voice light when I called, "Do you need anything else before you go?" The closeness between us stayed with me as the movie played on, a quiet warmth that made the room feel smaller and safer at the same time. Daniel shifted beside me now and then, and each time his arm brushed mine I noticed it, not with fear, but with a tenderness that settled deep in my chest. I realized that what I had been feeling all day was not something romantic at all, but the overwhelming ache of a mother seeing her child grow up and still needing her comfort. Halfway through the film, he moved a little closer, his shoulder resting against mine. I glanced at him and found his face calm in the dim light, his expression open in a way that made me understand how much he trusted me. Without thinking, I reached for his hand. He gave mine a light squeeze, and the simple gesture filled me with emotion. It was intimate in the way love between parent and child can be intimate, quiet, steady, and full of trust. We sat that way for a long time, fingers intertwined, neither of us needing to speak. By the time the movie ended, the credits rolled unnoticed. I leaned my head against his shoulder and felt him breathe beside me, slow and even. "Mom," he said softly. "Yes," I answered. "I'm really glad you're here," he whispered. The words warmed me more than the blanket around us ever could. "I'm glad I'm here too," I told him, and I meant it. In that moment, I understood that what I felt was not confusion, but gratitude. Gratitude for the bond we had built through years of hard days, honest conversations, and quiet acts of care. Whatever challenges had shaped us, we had not faced them alone. Later that night, after dinner had been cleared away and the house had fallen into a peaceful hush, we stepped out onto the back porch. The air was cool, the sky full of stars, and for the first time in a long while I felt the pressure in my chest begin to ease. Daniel stood beside me without speaking, and the silence between us felt full rather than empty. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it, smiling when his fingers laced through mine. There was no need to explain what that moment meant. It was simply a son reaching for his mother's reassurance, and a mother answering with all the steadiness she had. We sat together beneath the night sky, listening to the soft sounds of the world around us, and I felt certain of one thing. Whatever came next, we would meet it together. As the days passed, that sense of comfort remained. The little gestures, a shared look across the kitchen, a hand resting briefly on my shoulder, the easy conversations that filled the house, became reminders of how strong our connection was. It wasn't new in any dramatic sense. It was the same bond we had always shared, only deepened by time and hardship. Daniel was growing into a man, and I was learning how to let that happen without losing the closeness we had always depended on. One rainy afternoon in late autumn, we sat together on the couch while the storm tapped gently at the windows. A fire crackled nearby, turning the room amber and soft. Daniel leaned his head on my shoulder, and I ran my fingers through his hair the way I had when he was little, only now with the quiet awareness that he was no longer a child. He closed his eyes and let out a slow breath, and I felt the old, familiar tenderness rise in me. "Mom," he said after a while, his voice low. I looked down at him. "What is it?" He hesitated, then spoke with a careful honesty that had always made me trust him. "I know things have been hard. I just want you to know I see everything you've done for me." My throat tightened. "You never had to doubt that I love you," I said. He nodded, and in his expression I saw relief that came from being understood without judgment. "I love you too," he said. "I don't say it enough." That simple truth settled over the room like a blanket. I kissed the top of his head and held him a little closer, feeling something settle inside me too. Not longing, not confusion, just peace. For the first time in a long while, I could see our future clearly, not as something dramatic or uncertain, but as a life built on trust, mutual care, and the quiet strength that comes from staying connected even as life changes. He would keep growing, and I would keep being here, steady and present, as his mother should be. And that, I understood, was more than enough.